The first of many families to settle in Prince Edward County came shortly after the American Revolution. The Dorland family left their homes in Dutchess County, New York, to join the wave of loyalists heading to Upper Canada. The Dorlands were Quakers. Instrumental in establishing the Quaker faith in the county, the Dorland family name appears in many local history books. John T. Dorland Sr. was born on the shores of Hay Bay. Just next door was the McDonald farm. As a young boy hanging out with a neighbor kid, John likely never guessed who that kid would become. Once married and settled down, John spent the rest of his life in Wellington. By 1871, he owned nearly 300 acres. From the 1871 census, we know the farm was producing apples, oats, potatoes, peas and barley, corn, hay, wheat, and clover. John was a prosperous farmer. We know that he had a plow, a fanning mill, a horse rake, carriages, and sleighs. John had provided well for his family and was 58 years old. It was time for his adventurous son Gilbert to take over the family farm. John retained roughly 25 acres of the farm and spent the rest of his days at Lakeview. It was said of Gilbert Dorland that he was an adventurous person for whom farm life was too dull and unrewarding. Combing through available records would seem to prove just that. Gilbert was born in 1840. He was 18 when he left home for California at the tail end of the biggest gold rush in American history. By the time he arrived in California, newspapers were running articles warning those hoping to make their fortunes north near the Fraser River in British-occupied territory that their dreams could be met with nothing but failure. As published in the Daily Union, May the 6th, 1858, "Let none leave here who have not means and are determined to push through against all and every difficulty. Everybody will see that it's no child's play to get to the rich gold diggings, which have set the people who leap without looking half crazy." Gilbert wasn't buying it. He was long gone, headed north. Years later it was written, Gilbert Dorland was one of the discoverers of the Fraser placers. "There's gold in them there hills. Let's head to Idaho." Having found his share of gold in the Fraser Valley, Gilbert couldn't miss this chance, and he was off to try his luck in Boise. Here highlighted, we find Gilbert living in a boarding house in Boise in 1870. The census states he is 29, born in Canada, and a miner. After prospecting for gold in 3 territories for 12 years, Gilbert decided to go home. At the ripe old age of 29, Gilbert had traveled through North America, spending years in part of the country where legends were made. With money in his pockets, he decided it was time to settle down, build a house, and raise a family. Uncle Gilbert proceeded to build an imposing brick house near the site of his father's first home in Wellington. The new house stood well back from the village street with a terraced lawn shaded by many tall maple trees. It had 10-foot ceilings on the first floor and spacious rooms opening into each other through big arches which could be closed in the winter by folding doors. The dining room was floored with alternate strips of mahogany and maple. and there were marble mantels and fireplaces in several of the rooms. There was also a winding staircase with solid black walnut spindles, which continued up 3 flights to the attic, and even to a tower at the top of the house. While the tower was more pretentious than decorative, it commanded a lovely view. An afternoon spent at the local archives in Wellington produced pictures taken in the late 1900s of the house from different angles. Notice the scrollwork around the eaves was still intact at the time these pictures were taken. Gilbert soon married Sarah Ferguson. They had 3 sons, Finley, Gilbert Jr., and Arthur, who ran through the halls of this beautiful and stately home. Not the type to let the grass grow under his feet, Gilbert tried his hand at a few different ventures. He patented a spring horseshoe, which he produced at the old stone mill at Glenora. Gilbert also built one of the earliest steam-driven mills in the county. In April of 1879, for a tidy sum of $7,000, he bought 68 acres from his father and continued to operate the family farm. A month later, when the Prince Edward Railway Company proposed to lay tracks through his land, he promptly sold them 1/7 of an acre, ensuring his county goods could be shipped far and wide. For another 5 years, Gilbert and his family continued to live in their dream home. Then in 1884, an old familiar word crept into his vocabulary: gold. Gilbert sold everything he owned in Wellington, and he and his family were off to Montana. Gilbert and his family settled in Great Falls, Montana. The lure of placer mines brought him to York, Lewis, and Clark County, where he spent a large sum of money mining. In 1900, Gilbert and his wife were still in Montana. He was a merchant, living in a house he owned fair and square. In 1911, Gilbert's eldest son, Finley, who was living with his family in Montana, received a telegram from his brother in Vancouver, Washington. Gilbert had passed away. His obituary in the Anaconda Standard read, "A Western pioneer dead." Gilbert Dorland was a type of sturdy man that helped the West, the greatest section of the world, and in every section of Montana, friends will regret the demise of a courteous, kindly pioneer. The house Gilbert built continued to be a faithful home to many families. In the 1940s, it would become a lodge for summer tourists returning to enjoy the sandbanks and beaches as people had been doing since the early 1800s. Soon the house would return to a private residence, bought by owners that would keep the house for a good many years. The Dorland farm went on to produce vegetables and support the local canneries that the county would become famous for. Agricultural meetings were held in an old building to the rear of the house. The land was bought, sold, and divided until a few developers with a plan built a crescent and a few houses. They named it West Wind Crescent. Where my lovely wife, history buff, and producer of this short video, and me, her narrator husband, live today.